In this video, I'd like to talk about how to strategize when you develop and submit your work during the exam. This is the same strategy you should follow outside of an exam, like for instance, when you work in your homeworks, project, or elsewhere. Again, the idea is to try to develop your code incrementally and test often. And this is why in the exam and also in all of the homeworks, I have provided many testers so that you can test your work, get some feedback, and correct the mistakes. At the same time, you should pay attention to compile time errors that are not tested by the test code. Your code has to compile in order to be tested. If it doesn't compile, you'll get a compile time error, and again, it's a good idea to try to solve that error before you try to do something else. Otherwise, you're going for a walk in the dark. You cannot build something that doesn't compile to start with, or build on something which is not working to start with. So I'm going to try to go through the final practice BB. The solutions are posted, but I'm going to go through the process of developing and submitting the solution and getting it graded. So imagine I'm now in the exam room and I have this question. The very first thing I need to do is to read the question, okay? So take the time to read what the question is about before you rush and try to code something. Once again, it's a good idea to sketch like an initial solution on a piece of paper before you try to rush and do something on code. So maybe you want to pause the video now and just read what the question is about. And I'm going to scroll down so that you can read the rest of the question as well. All right. So the question is basically asking us to develop a class person to represent a personnel record in a company. So this kind of question is basically a class implementation, so it will specify the class structure, including attributes or fields, constructors, and also methods. And then it will ask you to implement some logic in these methods. This question is also asking us to extend the class person, so it includes some inheritance at the end. In this question, I usually give you empty class or classes, and then I give you a main method which contains testing scenarios so that you can test your code incrementally while you work. Okay? So let's take a look at the question. What makes sense is to try to finish the class structure first and then think about the implementation detail. Okay? And again, it's a good idea to look at all of these details in the question as well as the testers here. And I provided a tester for each bullet point. So you can see that each bullet point has a unit test associated with it. Okay, so it makes sense to try to get these early tests scored first before you try and finalize your submission. And again, I'm pulling the highest submission attempt during the exam time, which means if you score like 50% and then you mess things up, you will still get that 50% even if you get 0 in your last submission. So again, what makes sense is for you to try to get as many partial points as possible. And this is why I'm providing so many testers. I'm writing these testers so that you can get the most partial credit you can get. Okay? So in this example, we have got 23 testers. So I've gone to length to really code 23 test cases so that you can gain as many partial points as possible. So let's work on it. We've got 3 fields, 2 constructors, and a couple of methods. Most of them are getter and setter methods. So those are the easy things. Those are the bread and butter in implementing any class. You have to really memorize these things. A field, an attribute, is a variable belonging to the class. It has private data type attribute name. So I'm asking you to implement an attribute name in person. let's go to the class person and define that attribute private string name. SSN, which is also a string. Again, I'm giving you the name of that variable. It's data type. It's an attribute, so private string SSN. And then a boolean locked. So private boolean locked. So done with these attributes. Let's try to submit, see if you can get a partial credit on these three attributes. And say you get a compile time error, fix it at this point. Don't continue coding if you have a compile time error. It makes sense to develop your code incrementally, correct it incrementally, and don't complicate it if you get an error. So let's see what we've got. We've got the tester for the attribute name in person, good. SSN in person, and also locked in person. You actually get the credit for the constructor person, although we didn't provide any constructor, and this is because if you don't provide a constructor, Java will provide one for you. Okay. Say for instance you messed things up, you added like an extra bracket and you didn't know. You submit for grading, and of course this wouldn't even try the test code because your code doesn't compile. You will get a compile time error. What makes sense if you get such an error is to try to fix it rather than continue coding and hope for a miracle so that your code runs and works. It will not come, right? If you're doing Eclipse, you'll get like a context kind of highlight where that error is. If you're doing Zybox, it will tell you the line number, which is line number 8. Part of the line, the offending part, which is the bracket, and the description of the error, which is class interface or enum expected. So that's line number 8, and it's saying I'm expecting something here, but I saw a bracket. So reason through it and see what you've got. In this case, it's clear we had an extra bracket, take it out. Okay, so then it's asking you to implement two constructors, person that doesn't take any parameter and initializes name and SSN to NA and log to true, and then one that takes two string and initializes a name and SSN to the first and second parameter and log to be true. So let's define the first constructor, public person. This is the default one, and this one we will initialize name to NA and SSN to NA and locked to be true. And the second one will take name and SSN and will initialize name to name, SSN to SSN, and then locked to true. Now it helped to keep that constructor syntax in your mind so that you can really come up with a constructor without referring to external material to save time. We also have a choice here. Since locked is true is already here, we can call this, we can take out this line and call this first. So the first constructor works first, and then you do the remaining work, which is readjusting name and SSN. In the exam, there is no extra points for coming up with a nice code that is not redundant, because the code is tested on what it is outputting. So if you're not very familiar or don't think yourself very capable of making the code better organizationally, just don't do it. It's fine. Replicate the code. The goal is to get as many test score as possible, right? So right now we provided the two constructors, person, person, string, string. Let's submit, see if we get more points. And we did, so we've got 5 out of 23. We scored the fields, the two constructors as well. Next, the next step is to nail down the getter and the setter methods. And those are kind of almost freebies, because if you memorize the syntax for the getter method and the setter method, you'll just fill in that syntax here with the details. Basically, it's asking you to provide a getter method, setter method for name, and setter method for SSN. So let's do that. Public, the method has to be public, right? String get name, because it's a getter method, and this one will return name. Public void for a setter, set name. This one will take a string name and will initialize, or will set name to be name. And again, public void set SSN, and this one will set SSN to be equal to that parameter. It's SSN, social SSN. Again, don't forget the bracket, and even if you forget, try to reason about that compile time error. Now again, if you remember what we did in the classroom, you probably remember that I called the method set from the constructor so that I don't duplicate myself, and I can do that here. But again, you don't need to complicate it here. You're trying to get the points scored, not to come up with the best code on the surface of the planet. All right, that's the goal. So we've got the getter method and the setter method, and we can submit again. And hopefully we will get more testing points. And meanwhile, this is submitting and evaluating the submission. Let's read through the remaining methods. There's a method lock, which sets lock to be true, and a method unlock, which sets lock to be false only when that parameter, the password, equals MIST 4600. And then we have a toString method which will return name space SSN if the record is unlocked, or just name if the record is locked. Okay, so now we've got more testing points here. And actually, you can go to main and see if some of the scenarios can work. Like, notice scenario 1, it's creating that person object and doing system out println person. If you try to run scenario 1, probably the person object will be created, but you will not get Jack, which is the correct output here yet, because you've got that toString method missing. Okay, so this is the expected output. I always put it as a comment beside the print statement so that you know what this statement should produce. And this one is producing person at this number rather than Jack. Okay, so we're not there yet. Let's go and finish the methods. It's asking you to provide a method called lock, which will set lock to be true, and the method unlock, which will take a password as a parameter, and depending on it, it will set lock to be false. Now in this method, there is some logic here, right? And probably this is the first method which is much more involved than these methods, the easy ones. So here also you have the option of trying to get the test code for the class structure, the one that tests that this method exists, and then finish the logic later, right? Because those early testers will only test whether there is such a method in your code. So if you create a method stub, method header, and an empty body, if there is a return statement, you have to return something, obviously. If you do this, you'll still get that test point, right? You'll not get the later ones that will test whether the scenarios are working fine, because they will not be working fine, but you'll get that test point, okay? And I'm going actually to do the same thing for toString. I'm going to do a toString method here, and I will just return a string value that I will finish it later. again, my goal is to get these testers tested fine. All of the testers in defining the class structure don't care about the details. The later tests that test for scenarios, the output will depend on the details. The moment you provide a method a method stub, you should get that test point scored. All right, so we've got 11 out of 23, so we are at 50%. We've got the method unlock, the toString, although they're empty, they exist and there are no compile time errors, so we got that incorrect. Of course, the scenarios are incorrect too, because the toString method now returns to do, right? So we need to fix that to get a point. But notice that you get at 50%, and this is just like a simple class implementation, nothing involved yet. Let's finish unlocked and toString. And both of these methods, they need to test for something. The unlock method should test whether the password is MIC4600. If so, it will set lock to false. Okay. So we need an if statement here to test whether the password is MIC4600. Now again, here is where the details matter, and you may get issues and you may need to test and figure out what's going on. The point in this exercise is that when you test for string equality, you need to use .equals, as we've seen, and done. Don't use equals equals, otherwise it doesn't work. Okay, so if password equals MIC4600, you will get locked. You set lock to false. That's unlock, and then toString will test the value of locked here. If the value is locked is true, it will just return name because the record is locked. Otherwise, returns name space SSN. So that's a simple if statement. If locked, return name, else return name plus a space plus SSN. Okay, now again, maybe you want to test it before submitting it. Let's go and test some of these scenarios in develop mode. And the advantage of develop mode is that you can change the main, you can do things, and also it takes much less time than submitting, because submitting runs a battery of tests that take time to also evaluate the code. So let's take a look at the first scenario. Person, system.out.println person. If our code is working fine, we should get Jack printed out. And we did. Let's test the locking mechanism here. We provided an incorrect password, so that shouldn't unlock the record, so we should still see Jack, right? And let's take a look at scenario 3. If we provide the correct password, after we unlock the record, we should see name and SSN printed out. Okay, and we did. Of course, you can try the remaining scenarios. And we can submit now. We can submit the code. Go to person, go to person again, and submit the code. And hopefully we'll get more points added to the grade. Now also notice that if you make a mistake here in the unlock method, you should still get a partial point, because 2 of the scenarios will work fine and 1 of them will not work fine. So even if you don't know, or if you missed on using .equals instead of equals equals, you will still get 2 extra test points. Like right now you got 14. Say for the sake of this example, you forget that it's .equals instead of equals equals, you should still get 13 out of 23. And then when you get that, you need to reason why this happened. right? And the way to do it is to look at the test codes and also run the scenarios in the main method. Okay. All right, so you run the code here. Go back to the dot equals method. And let's take a look at the remaining points. Now it's asking you to implement some further improvements. So they're defining an extra attribute called entry trials in person, and then increase that entry trials when an incorrect password is entered. When the number of trials exceeds 3, you display a record frozen. Please contact your system admin. And also in the toString method, the number of trials, if that number is 3 or more, you return frozen record. So let's take a look at how this is tested. For instance, in scenario 4, we create a new person, we printed, so we should get that. And then if you try to unlock 3 times, you get that printed out, record frozen, please contact system admin. And then if you try to print the person object, you will get frozen record as a result. Okay, so let's go to person and follow the details. Again, define attribute entry trials, which is an integer. Same thing, private int entry trials. We need to initialize it. Let's initialize it to 0. I'm going to initialize it here, or you can do it in the constructor here or there. It doesn't make a difference. And then each time in unlock, if you get an incorrect password, you increase it by 1. So you've got 3 chances. Let's go to unlock here. So if the password is fine, you just set lock to be false. Otherwise, you need to increase number of trials by 1. Sorry, entry trials by 1. So that's that. You increase it by 1. That's the first step. Now, once you do that, you will need to decide if number of trials exceeded 3. So if entry trials, again, take a look at main. It will give you an idea about how this is tested. If you try to unlock 1, 2, 3, at the third time you get record frozen, please contact system admin. So what I'm going to do here, go to person. If entry trials exceeds 3, I'm going to do system.out.println record frozen. Please contact your admin. And then I'm going to change the toString method, because the toString method will need to do the same. If the number of trials is 3 or more, it has to return frozen record. So I'm going to do the same. If entry of trials is more than 3, return, because this one returns, doesn't print, return frozen record. So I'm not even going to think about it. I'm going to copy that from the assignment text. So maybe it makes sense to try to see if you get that in develop mode, because develop mode is faster than submitting. So that's what we need to see in scenario 4. We need to see Maria, and then we need to see frozen record, and then record frozen, please contact system admin, and then frozen record here. And that's what we see, right? And then frozen record. So it should looks fine. So hopefully if we run the test codes, we should get the scenarios here. Then the entry of trial and also scenario 4 scored fine. So we should get to 16 out of 23. While this is evaluating the submission, let's take a look at the remaining questions. This is basically a question about inheritance. It's basically asking you to make class employee inherit from person, define attribute salary, and provide getter method, setter method for salary, and also toString method. So the idea here is that you want to extend an employee is a person that has a salary. Getter setter method, straightforward. And then the toString method has to attach the salary to the result of the toString method in person. So that's probably the most involved method. And as you can see, we got 16 out of 23. So let's go to the class employee, and again we follow the same strategy, bullet point by bullet point. Make class employee inherit from person. How do we do that? By making a class extend another class. If you submit, you should get at least 1 point extra. So I'm going to do this and continue working while this is evaluating, and hopefully we will see this increases to 17. Now it's asking us to define attribute salary double in employee. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do private. Oh, it's not letting us because it's submitting. Let's wait. So I'm going to define an attribute as usual, and then a getter and setter method of that attribute in employee. So we got that scored. Let's continue. Private double salary. Public double get salary. Again, the syntax of a getter and setter method, you have to memorize these so to avoid trying to refer to any extra notes or documentation. Get those really quick. Set salary, double salary, this.salary should be set to salary here. Don't forget the bracket. Okay, you do that, and you should get, if we submit, at least 1, 2, 3, 3 more points. So that will get you to 20, up to 23. The final method is the toString method, basically asking you to attach the salary of the result to the toString method in person. Again, it helps here to take a look at an example here, which is scenario 5 and scenario 6. It's basically creating an employee object here, set name, set SSN, set salary, and then system out println employee should be name plus salary, right? Doesn't hurt to try it on our own. Let's see. Again, we got extra points. Let's now go to develop mode and run. And if you run, you'll actually not see this salary here. You will see the name of the person because it inherited the toString method from the base class, and that's why it's still not adding salary. Same thing, if you run scenario 6 and you unlock that employee and you print, you'll get the employee name and SSN, and you will not see the salary because it's running the toString method in the base class. So really, it's the last point. Once you implement the toString method in employee, you should get those 2 scenarios as well as the point for the toString method, which will give you the full grade. So again, public string toString. Once again, if you just want to get this point without thinking about the details, just return anything and you should get that test score given to you. So you will get 21 out of 23. And that's basically that unit test, which tests for the existence of the method in employee, right? So again, just providing a method stub will get you 1 extra point. And then you can finish the details. For the sake of time, I'm just going to finish this one. It's basically asking you to attach salary to whatever toString method in person is doing. So first part, this is what we did in the class, support a toString. And then let's take a look at main. It's actually putting a space and a $sign, and that's what we need in employee. We want to return first part plus space $sign plus salary, and that will attach salary to that employee object. Let me run in develop mode, see if I get that printed out. Looks fine. Submit, and hopefully I will get the 3 points scored. And again, take a look at my previous submissions. I built this really incrementally, tried to get as many points as possible by doing things step by step, ensuring that the code is error-free, compiles, getting the easy stuff first, get the class structure, get the fields, get the constructors and the methods. If you have a lengthy method, create a method stub and then finish the details later on. Don't stumble on a method you can't finish. Like if you get a problem with this unlock with the dot equals, just make sure the code compiles and carry on, and hopefully you will get as many of these points as possible.